team walks through that door right over there, they immediately accept 3 burdens. First, the burden of harms, as you're probably well aware of, meaning that they're going to present a harm in the status quo, and furthermore, that harm is worth your attention, that it's worth your ballot, and that it's worth the attention of the actor in the resolution, that being the United States. Once they presented this burden, the second one that must follow that is the burden of solvency, meaning that they are going to be presenting not only a problem that's worth your attention, but a solution that's worth your attention, because that solution will solve the problem. And finally, if they present any advantages, that those advantages will in fact outweigh the disadvantages. But it's also the negative team's contention that the affirmative team fails these burdens, mainly for the key reason that they failed the links. They presented all this evidence, but they haven't provided adequate links to connect that to the plan. I first want to look at that in the observation of facts. My first fact is that terrorists can appeal. Terrorists can appeal. One of the very first questions my partner asked in his cross-examination was, can terrorists appeal to the federal courts? Were y'all listening? Did you hear the answer? The answer was yes. What that means is that terrorists already have access to these federal courts. So the question I'm asking is, why are we giving them mandated access if they already have access? And that leads me to my second point under facts. Terrorists have appealed. Terrorists have appealed. Not only do terrorists have access to these courts, but furthermore, they've taken advantage of this situation because now they've appealed. I believe the second question my partner asked in cross-ex was, have terrorists appealed to these federal courts? For y'all listening, the answer was yes. What that means is 660 court cases have been tried, and I believe they've been convicted with the terrorists in those federal courts. The impact of this for you to write on your flow is that federal courts effectively used. Federal courts are effectively used. We see that terrorists have access to the courts, and terrorists have taken advantage of this, and they have gone to these, or the status quo has taken advantage of this, and they've gone to these courts, which means that the affirmative team is essentially making no difference because they're just laying something out more clear, but it's still happening in the status quo. Now let's look on to the second observation I really want to spend our time together on, solvency. The first point I want to make under here is no proportional comparison of convictions. I'll say that slow. No proportional comparison of convictions. In saying that the affirmative team's plan is going to be improving the amount of convictions, the process of the convictions from the military commissions to the federal courts, what they have to show is that there's a substantial improvement in what we see with the status quo and the harms of what's going on with what the affirmative team's plan is causing. But in looking at the evidence they've provided to show the problem and the deficit between the commissions and the courts, what we find is that they still actually haven't substantiated it, remember, because of those links I told you about. This first one is the no proportional comparison of convictions. See, they only showed the number of convictions. They said that in cross-examination, I believe the numbers were brought up, how 8 terrorists have been convicted in military in military courts, and then military commissions, and then 660 had been convicted in the federal courts. The problem is they never showed you how many had been tried. So for all we know, 8 terrorists had been brought to the military commissions, 8 terrorists have been convicted. 1,000 terrorists have been brought to the federal court commissions, only 660 have been convicted. Is that efficiency? No, that's not. It's the affirmative team's burden to show that not only were only 8 convicted in the military courts, but that a substantial number more than that were tried to show that there's a deficit between the trials and the convictions. On the same side, we have to see that regarding the federal courts, that there's not only 660 have been tried, but also have been convicted, but a number similar to that to show the efficiency of those convictions needs to be presented. Otherwise, these numbers are meaningless because they have no context. And in fact, we see this exact same problem with the no proportional comparison of trials. No proportional comparison of trials. This argument is actually extremely similar to my argument about convictions. I'm just swapping out a key word because this is the second major burden that the affirmative team under solvency that the affirmative team has to show. They need to show that the amount of terrorists who are tried under both of these courts to see that there's a deficit between the trials and the convictions. Finally, my third point under solvency is that there's no comparison of finances. No comparison of finances. When we're passing a policy, what we need to do is make sure that we're spending our money effectively. So if we're trying to improve the status quo for their purposes of due time and due punishment, then what we need to make sure is that outweighs the disadvantages. But the affirmative team hasn't shown that because they haven't provided no comparison of finances. We know that terrorists are able to go to federal courts. We've established that fact. We've established that the status quo is functioning no matter how lazy it may be. But what they need to show in doing that is, what we're going to argue here, is that not only is the status quo working, but if you pass the affirmative team's plan, you'd be wasting money because they haven't shown that the military commissions are cheap, that are more expensive than the federal courts. What we're asking here is for them to show that the military commissions are more expensive, that the status quo is spending more time, and more specifically more money, on getting these terrorists through those military commissions than they are with federal courts. Because until we see that the federal courts are cheaper, you have the disadvantage or the impact of this solvency point as wasted money. Wasted money. Until they can show that the federal courts are cheaper, you'll be wasting money on a plan that at bare minimum is doing essentially the same thing of their plan, but now not only are you spending money to get this plan in place, but they also need to show that this is cheaper on the second aspect of that. At the beginning of my speech, I told you that the affirmative team had 3 burdens that I know all of you are well aware of. The burden of facts, the burden of harm, the burden of solvency, and the burden of disadvantages. After I told you that, my contention was that the affirmative team had failed to link these burdens. It's still my contention at the end of this speech that they failed to do so. I hope it's your contention as well. Thank you very much. Yeah, of course.
Right, now if everyone's set. My first question is, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Congratulations on breaking it next. It's awesome.
Thanks, you too. All right, my next question has to do with the philosophy of the negative team. Is it your idea that we should preserve military commissions?
It's my idea that we need to spend our money and our resources most effectively, and if military commissions are, in the end, doing an effective job or doing a decent job at trying terrorists, then we don't see a significant problem with them.
All right, so you believe there's a reason to preserve military commissions?
Maybe not a reason, but there's at least maybe not a reason to preserve military commissions, but there's not a reason to eliminate them.
All right, thank you so much. Now, you've also talked about how we apparently failed links to uphold our plan in today's debate round. And the first fact that you brought up under your argument in your speech was that terrorists can appeal.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, can we examine the background of this? Are you discussing how military commissions, if terrorists are tried in military commissions, they can appeal to federal courts?
If I'm being honest, I'm not 100% aware of the details of how terrorists get access to the federal courts, but in cross-examination, the most important part of the argument was very clearly seen that terrorists ultimately do have access to federal courts.
All right, now, did you provide any evidence that terrorists can appeal to federal courts?
No, what we found is that in order for terrorists to have access to federal courts, we saw that terrorists have to find a way to get to federal courts. The key word I used was appealed, but if that's wrong, by all means, correct.
All right, now, would you agree that in my speech I was talking about how terrorists can be convicted by federal courts?
That still represents the fact that terrorists can go from the military commissions to the federal courts. That still means
Did
that
I
the essence.
specifically say that terrorists could go from the military commissions to the federal courts?
That was just a choice of wording. It doesn't have to be that exact situation. As long as the terrorists are going to the federal courts, that's just the specifics of your plans. That's the main detail we have to see, and that's the detail that we are seeing.
All right, now, going down to your solvency, you pressed the significance of our case a little bit. You talked about how we need a proportional comparison of a few different things. And one of the things you talked about was a proportional comparison of trials. Now, really quickly in my speech, would you agree that I mentioned, besides the numbers about how many people have been tried or convicted, that 32 charges are available in military commissions versus 4,000 in federal courts.
Yes, but if 4,000 have been made in the federal courts and only 660 have been convicted, I do see a deficit there.
All right. Now, you also talked about a proportional comparison of finances. Let's say federal courts turn out to actually cost more. Would you agree that we're actually, if we try to uphold due punishment in due time with our case, that we're talking about justice, not finances?
Well, terrorists are recognized as criminals. Terrorists are recognized as international criminals, and I would go so far as the terrorists are recognized as some of the worst criminals in the world. So if I'm being honest, I'm not sure if justice needs to be our very first priority.
All right. Would you agree that it's important to convict 9/11 terrorists?
9/11 was a while ago, but sure, I believe in some respect that should warrant some of our attention.
All right. Thank you so much.